In the spring of 1976, in Kingfisher County, Oklahoma, a 40-year-old farmer named Howard Jessup made a decision that his neighbors would laugh about for years. He planted sorghum, not wheat, like every other farmer in the county, not corn or soybeans or any of the profitable crops that filled the grain elevators every harvest. Sorghum, a tall, sturdy grain that most Oklahoma farmers considered cattle feed at best, a waste of good land at worst. Howard planted 200 acres of it. Word spread through the county like wildfire. At the feed store, at the diner, at church on Sunday morning, everyone was talking about Howard Jessup and his crazy decision. Did you hear? Howard's planting sorghum. All 200 acres. Sorghum. What's he thinking? You can't make money on sorghum. Maybe he's lost his mind. Should we say something? I tried. He just smiled and kept planting. The John Deere dealer in Kingfisher, a man named Virgil Tate, drove out to Howard's farm in early May to see for himself. He found Howard on his tractor, pulling a planter through the red Oklahoma dirt, dropping sorghum seeds into the ground. Virgil flagged him down. Howard. Virgil walked to the edge of the field, shaking his head. I had to see it with my own eyes. You're really doing this? Howard climbed down from the tractor and wiped the dust from his face. Morning, Virgil. Morning, nothing. What are you doing? Sorghum? Every farmer in this county plants wheat. Wheat prices are through the roof. The export market's booming. Why would you plant sorghum? Howard looked out at his field, the neat rows of freshly planted earth, the promise of something growing where nothing had grown before. You want the short answer or the long answer? I want any answer that makes sense. Howard smiled slightly. The short answer is, my grandfather told me to. Virgil stared at him. Your grandfather's been dead for 30 years, I know. But he left something behind. Virgil waited for more, but Howard just climbed back onto his tractor. Wrong crop, Howard, Virgil called after him. Wheat is gold out here. Sorghum is what you plant when you've given up. Everyone's going to think you've lost your mind. Howard started the engine. Maybe so. We'll see who's right. He drove on down the row, leaving Virgil standing at the edge of a field that didn't make sense to anyone but Howard. Let me tell you about the journal, because that's where this story really begins. Howard Jessup's grandfather, Elmer Jessup, had been a farmer in Kingfisher County since He'd survived the land rush, the First World War, the boom times of the 20s, and then something that nearly destroyed him, the Dust Bowl. The 1930s were apocalyptic in Oklahoma. Drought, wind, and decades of poor farming practices combined to create the worst environmental disaster in American history. The topsoil, the precious layer of earth that made farming possible, simply blew away, leaving behind hardpan and despair. Elmer Jessup lost almost everything. His wheat crop failed in 1931, 1932, 1934, and 5 years of nothing. 5 years of watching the sky for rain that never came, watching the wind carry his future to Kansas. But Elmer didn't leave. Unlike the thousands of Okies who packed their cars and headed for California, Elmer stayed, and in 1936, when the drought was at its worst, he did something unexpected. He planted sorghum. Not much, just 20 acres, an experiment born of desperation. He'd read about sorghum in a government pamphlet, learned that it could survive on less water than wheat, that its deep roots could find moisture where other crops couldn't. That year, while every wheat field in the county lay dead and brown, Elmer's sorghum stood green. It wasn't much of a crop. The yields were low, the price was poor, but it was something. And in 1936, something was everything. Elmer kept planting sorghum through the rest of the Dust Bowl years, mixing it with whatever wheat he could manage. He survived when others didn't, and when the rains finally came back, when wheat became profitable again, Elmer went back to planting wheat like everyone else. But he never forgot. In 1945, the year before he died, Elmer Jessup sat down and wrote a journal. Not about his life, not about his family, but about farming, about what he'd learned in 50 years of working Oklahoma soil, about the mistakes he'd made and the lessons he'd paid for in sweat and tears. The journal ended with a warning. The drought will come again. It always does. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it will come. When it does, remember what I learned. Wheat dies in the dry years. Sorghum survives. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. Elmer died in 1946. The journal went into a trunk in the attic of the farmhouse, and there it stayed for 30 years, until Howard found it. Now let me tell you about Howard and the attic, because that's the moment that changed everything. It was February 1976. Howard had been farming the family land for 15 years, since his father passed in That February, a winter storm damaged the farmhouse roof. Howard had to go into the attic to check for leaks, and that's when he found the trunk. He'd known it was there, vaguely. His mother had mentioned it once, your grandfather's old things, but Howard had never bothered to look. Farming didn't leave much time for nostalgia. Now, stuck in the attic waiting out the storm, he opened it. Inside was a collection of artifacts from a life he'd never known. Old photographs of people he didn't recognize, a pocket watch that didn't work, a Bible with names and dates written inside the cover, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, a leather-bound journal. Howard opened it and started reading. 3 hours later, when Dorothy came looking for him, she found her husband sitting in the cold attic, tears on his face, holding a book that had been written before he was born. "Howard, what is it? What's wrong?" Howard looked up at her. "My grandfather. He knew what was coming, and he wrote it all down, and we never—" He stopped, wiped his eyes. "We never even looked." "Knew what?" Howard handed her the journal. "Read the last page." Dorothy read it. When she finished, she looked at her husband with confusion. "He's talking about drought. So what? We have droughts every few years. It's Oklahoma. Not like the one he's describing. Not like the 30s. Howard stood up, his mind racing. "Dorothy, do you know what I've been reading for the last 3 hours? How to survive a disaster that I never believed could happen. Crop rotation patterns, water conservation. Which varieties survive dry years and which don't." "Howard, that was 40 years ago. Farming is different now. The weather isn't different. The rain doesn't know it's night." Howard picked up the journal. "My grandfather watched his neighbors pack up and leave for California. He watched families that had been here for generations just disappear, and he swore he'd never let that happen to us." He looked at his wife with an intensity she'd rarely seen. "He planted sorghum, Dorothy. When everyone else was losing everything, he planted sorghum, and it saved him. And he wrote it all down so that I would know what to do when it happened again. If it happens again." "When?" Howard's voice was firm. "The drought always comes back. He said so. And I believe him." That night, Howard Jessup made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever found something that changed how you see the world? A letter, a photograph, a document that made you understand your family in a completely new way? That's what happened to Howard in that attic. In 3 hours of reading, he went from a man who farmed the way his neighbors farmed, to a man who understood that he was part of something larger, a chain of knowledge stretching back generations, preserved in a journal that nobody had bothered to read. His grandfather had seen the worst, had survived it, had written down how, and now Howard had to decide, trust the old man's words, or trust the neighbors who said wheat was gold. He chose his grandfather. Now let me tell you about the mockery, because that's what Howard endured for 4 years. Spring 1976. Howard plants 200 acres of sorghum. His neighbors laugh. "Wrong crop, Howard. You'll regret that come harvest." "What are you, a cattle rancher now?" The harvest came. Wheat prices were high, over $4 a bushel. Howard's neighbors made money hand over fist. Howard's sorghum sold for less than $2, barely covering his costs. "Told you so," Virgil Tate said at the feed store. "Wheat is gold. Sorghum is for fools." Howard just smiled. We'll see. Spring 1977. Howard plants sorghum again. More laughter. You didn't learn your lesson. Maybe he likes losing money. Some people just can't be helped. Another good year for wheat. Another mediocre year for Howard's sorghum. His neighbors were starting to look at him with something between pity and contempt. At church one Sunday, Dorothy overheard two women talking. I feel sorry for Dorothy Jessup, married to a man who can't admit when he's wrong. Dorothy wanted to say something, but what could she say? Her husband was planting the wrong crop, year after year, based on a journal written by a man who'd been dead for 30 years. She was starting to wonder if the women were right. Spring 1978. Howard plants sorghum again. By now, the jokes had become routine. People didn't even bother hiding their amusement. Wrong crop Howard, they called him. It wasn't quite an insult, more like a nickname for the town eccentric, the man who didn't know any better. Howard's son, Tommy, came home from school one day with a black eye. What happened? Dorothy demanded. Billy Tate said Dad was an idiot. Said his dad says we're going to lose the farm because Dad doesn't know how to be a real farmer. Howard put down his newspaper and looked at his son. What did you do? I punched him. Howard was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up and walked to the bookshelf where he kept Elmer's journal. He brought it back to the table and opened it. Sit down, Tommy. I want to show you something. For the next hour, Howard read passages from his grandfather's journal. He explained about the Dust Bowl, about the neighbors who left, about the sorghum that survived when nothing else did. Your great-grandfather wrote this in He said the drought would come back. He said to plant sorghum before it comes, not after. After is too late. Tommy looked at the old handwriting, the faded pages. But Dad, everyone says wheat is better. Everyone said that in 1932, and in 1931, 1934, and 1935, 5 years of everyone being wrong. Howard closed the journal. Sometimes the crowd isn't right, son. Sometimes the old ways know things the new ways have forgotten. But what if Grandpa Elmer was wrong? What if the drought doesn't come? Howard put his hand on his son's shoulder. Then I'll be the fool everyone says I am. But if he was right, if the drought comes and we're ready, we'll be the only family in this county that survives. He looked at his son with steady eyes. I'd rather be wrong and safe than right and destroyed. Wouldn't you? Spring 1979. Howard plants sorghum again. 4 years now. 4 years of being laughed at. 4 years of lower profits. 4 years of wrong crop Howard. And then the weather changed. Let me tell you about 1980, because that's when Howard's grandfather reached across 40 years and saved the family. The winter of 1979 was dry, not unusually dry, just dry. The spring rains came late, and when they came, they were sparse. By May, farmers were starting to worry. By June, they were praying. July was brutal. Day after day of 100-degree heat. Day after day of cloudless skies. Day after day of watching the wheat, that precious, profitable wheat that everyone had planted, begin to wither. The wheat plant is a thirsty crop. It needs regular rain, especially during the growing season. When the rain doesn't come, the wheat doesn't grow. And when the heat comes on top of the drought, the wheat dies. By the end of July 1980, every wheat field in Kingfisher County was in crisis. Howard drove through the county one afternoon, looking at his neighbors' fields. What he saw reminded him of the photographs in his grandfather's journal, the black and white images of the Dust Bowl, the dead crops, the cracked earth. The wheat was brown and brittle. In some fields it had stopped growing entirely. In others, the stalks had fallen over, too weak to stand. The heads that should have been full of grain were shriveled and empty. It's happening, Howard said to himself. Just like he said. He drove home and walked out to his own fields. His 200 acres of sorghum. The plants were stressed. You could see it in the curled leaves, the slowed growth. Sorghum is drought-resistant, not drought-proof. But they were alive. They were standing. They were going to produce a crop. Not a great crop. Not a record-breaking crop, but a crop. Dorothy found him standing at the edge of the sorghum field, looking out at the rows of surviving plants. "Howard," he turned to her, and she was surprised to see tears in his eyes. "He was right," Howard said. 40 years ago he wrote it down, and he was right. Dorothy stood beside her husband and looked at the sorghum, the wrong crop that everyone had laughed at. "What happens now?" "Now," Howard wiped his eyes, "now we harvest whatever we can, and then we see how bad it gets for everyone else." It got very bad. Let me tell you about the harvest of 1980, because that's when the county understood what Howard had done. By September, the numbers were in. Kingfisher County's wheat crop was down 60% from the previous year. 60%. Some farms were worse. Some had lost everything. Their fields nothing but stubble and dust. The grain elevator in Kingfisher, which usually hummed with activity during harvest season, was half empty. Farmers who normally brought in thousands of bushels were bringing in hundreds. Some brought nothing at all. And then Howard Jessup drove up with his sorghum. The elevator operator, a man named Glenn Mueller, watched Howard's truck pull onto the scale with something like disbelief. "Sorghum?" Glenn said. "I'll be damned." "Morning, Glenn." "Howard, I gotta be honest with you, I don't remember the last time someone brought sorghum to this elevator. We might have to look up the price." "Take your time." Glenn disappeared into his office. When he came back, he was shaking his head. "You're not going to believe this. Sorghum prices are up, way up. The feedlots in Texas are desperate for anything they can get. The hay crop failed too, you know. They're paying $3.20 a bushel." Howard nodded. "I heard it might go higher." "It might. Wouldn't surprise me." Glenn looked at Howard's truck, then at the empty elevator around them. "How much you got?" "About 6,000 bushels, give or take." Glenn did the math in his head. That's nearly $20,000, Howard." "I know. From sorghum." "From sorghum." Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then he started to laugh. Not the mocking laugh that Howard had heard for 4 years, but something else. Something like wonder. "Wrong crop, Howard," Glenn said. "Turns out you were right crop, Howard, all along." The news spread faster than the drought had. Howard Jessup harvested 6,000 bushels of sorghum. Howard Jessup made $20,000 when his neighbors made nothing. Howard Jessup planted the wrong crop for 4 years, and now he was the only farmer in the county with money in his pocket. At the feed store, at the diner, at church on Sunday, everywhere Howard went, people stared at him differently. "How did you know?" they asked. "How did you know to plant sorghum?" Howard gave the same answer every time. "My grandfather told me." Let me tell you about 1981, because the drought wasn't finished yet. If 1980 was bad, 1981 was worse. The winter brought almost no snow. The spring brought almost no rain. By June, the county was in the grip of the worst drought since the 1930s, since the years that Howard's grandfather had written about in his journal. This time, some farmers tried to switch to sorghum, but it was too late. They didn't have the seeds, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the equipment properly set up. Some planted anyway and got poor results. Most just watched their wheat die for the 2nd year in a row. Howard's sorghum survived again. Not as well as the year before. The drought was deeper now, testing even the tough grain's limits, but well enough. 4,000 bushels, at prices that had climbed to nearly $4 a bushel. $16,000, while his neighbors made nothing. By the fall of 1981, the first foreclosures began. Dale Watkins, who had farmed 400 acres north of town, couldn't make his payments. The bank took his land. The Mitchell brothers, who had expanded aggressively in the late 70s, couldn't service their debt. They lost everything. Virgil Tate's dealership, which had sold all those shiny new John Deeres on credit, started repossessing tractors from farmers who couldn't pay. Half of them sat on his lot for months because nobody was buying. Howard watched it all happen with a mixture of sadness and grim validation. These were his neighbors, his friends, people he'd known his whole life. He didn't want to see them suffer, but he'd tried to warn them. Not directly. Nobody would have listened. but by example. 4 years of planting the wrong crop. 4 years of showing them a different way. They'd laughed instead of learned. Now they were paying the price. Let me tell you about the land, because that's where Howard's story reaches its peak. In the spring of 1982, Howard went to see Virgil Tate at the John Deere dealership. Virgil looked different than he had in 1970. The confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man watching his world collapse. His lot was full of repossessed equipment. His showroom was empty of customers. Howard. Virgil managed a weak smile. Come to gloat? No. Howard sat down across from the dealer's desk. I came to make you an offer. An offer? For what? The Watkins place. I heard the bank's looking to sell. Virgil's eyebrows rose. You want to buy Dale's farm? If the price is right. Howard, that's 400 acres. Even at distressed prices, you're talking serious money. I have serious money. Howard pulled out a bank statement and slid it across the desk. 3 years of sorghum. 3 years of being laughed at. Turns out laughing at people isn't a great investment strategy. Virgil looked at the statement. His face went pale. $62,000 plus what I'll make this year if the sorghum comes in. Howard leaned back in his chair. I figure I can offer the bank a fair price, more than they'd get at auction. And I can pay cash. Virgil was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick. You know, Howard, I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. I called you a fool for 4 years. Wrong crop, Howard. I said it to your face. I said it behind your back. I said it to anyone who would listen. Virgil shook his head. And you were right. The whole time you were right. I wasn't right. My grandfather was right. I just listened. Same thing, isn't it? Howard considered that. Maybe that's all wisdom is, listening to people who came before. They made the mistakes so we wouldn't have to. We just have to be smart enough to learn from them. He stood up and extended his hand. Help me buy that land, Virgil, and then maybe help me find some more. The way things are going, there's going to be a lot of farms for sale. Virgil shook his hand. What are you going to plant? Howard smiled. What do you think? By 1985, Howard Jessup owned 800 acres. He'd bought the Watkins place, the Mitchell brothers' land, and 2 other farms from families who couldn't hold on. He paid fair prices, more than the banks were asking, because he knew what it meant to lose your land. He didn't want to be the kind of man who profited from his neighbor's despair, but profit he did. With 800 acres of sorghum diversified now with some drought-resistant wheat varieties and a small herd of cattle, Howard Jessup had become the largest farmer in Kingfisher County. More than that, he'd become something else. A teacher. Starting in 1982, when it became clear that the drought wasn't ending anytime soon, farmers started coming to Howard for advice. Not to mock him anymore, to learn from him. They came to his kitchen table. They came to his fields. They came to his equipment shed to see how he'd modified his planters for sorghum seed. Howard taught them everything he knew. He shared his grandfather's journal, made copies of the key pages so others could read them. He explained about drought-resistant crops, about crop rotation, about the cycles of wet years and dry years that had shaped Oklahoma farming for generations. My grandfather learned this the hard way, Howard told them. In the 30s, when people were loading up their cars and driving to California, he stayed. He survived. He wrote it all down so that someone would remember. Why didn't you tell us before? One farmer asked. Back in '76, when you first planted sorghum, why didn't you warn us? Howard sighed. Would you have listened? The farmer was quiet for a moment. No, probably not. That's why I didn't tell you. I showed you instead. 4 years of showing you, and even then you didn't see. Howard's voice wasn't angry, just sad. People don't listen to warnings. They don't believe something can happen until it happens. My grandfather knew that. That's why he said to plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. Because after is when people finally believe. And after is too late. Let me tell you about the journal. Because that's the heart of this story. In 1992, the Kingfisher County Historical Society asked Howard if they could display his grandfather's journal in their museum. Howard agreed, but first he did something he'd been thinking about for years. He sat down and added his own chapter. This journal was written by my grandfather, Elmer Jessup, in 1945. He meant it for his children and grandchildren, but it sat unread in an attic for 30 years until I found it in 19... What I read in these pages changed my life. My grandfather survived the Dust Bowl by planting sorghum when everyone else planted wheat. He saved his family, his farm, his future, and then he wrote it all down so that someone would remember. I read his words in February 19... That spring, I planted sorghum for the first time. My neighbors laughed at me. They called me Wrong Crop Howard. They said I was throwing money away. In 1980, the drought came, just like my grandfather said it would. The wheat died. The sorghum survived. I made money when others made nothing. I bought land when others lost everything. I am writing this in 1992, 16 years after I found this journal. I am 76 years old. I own 800 acres, all paid for, all productive. I have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. None of this would exist without my grandfather's words. To whoever reads this next, the drought will come again. It always does. Remember what Elmer Jessup learned in the 19th. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. Learn from the past before you have to learn from your own mistakes. The old ways are not always wrong. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. Howard Jessup, November 9th. The journal sits in the Kingfisher County Historical Society to this day. Visitors can see both entries, Elmer's original warning and Howard's confirmation, side by side on facing pages. The museum calls it the Jessup Journal, 2 generations of Oklahoma wisdom. Let me end this story where it began, in a field of sorghum, with a man who listened. Howard Jessup died in 2001, at the age of 65. He worked his farm until the last month of his life, finally slowing down when his heart wouldn't let him do otherwise. His funeral was the largest in Kingfisher County history. Farmers came from 3 states to pay their respects, men and women who had learned from Howard, who had been saved by his teaching, who owed their farms to a piece of advice about sorghum. His son Tommy, the boy who came home with a black eye in 1978, gave the eulogy. "My father taught me many things," Tommy said. "How to work the land, how to fix a tractor, how to tell when rain was coming. But the most important thing he taught me was this: listen to the people who came before you. They paid for their knowledge with sweat and tears. We get it for free if we're wise enough to pay attention." Tommy held up his great-grandfather's journal, the leather-bound book that had traveled from Elmer's hands to Howard's to his. "This journal saved our family. Not once, but twice. In the 1930s, when my great-grandfather wrote it, and in the 1980s, when my father read it. Both times, the men in this family were called fools. Both times, they were proven right." He looked out at the crowd, at the farmers and their families, at the people who had once laughed at Wrong Crop Howard, and were now here to honor him. My father could have kept this journal secret. He could have let his neighbors fail and bought their land for pennies. Instead, he taught everyone who would listen. He shared the wisdom that saved him, because he believed that helping your neighbor was more important than getting ahead. Tommy closed the journal. "My father planted the wrong crop for 4 years while everyone laughed. He did it because he trusted his grandfather's words more than the crowd's opinion. And he was right. The drought came, the sorghum survived, and Howard Jessup became the richest farmer in Kingfisher County. Not in money, but in something more valuable. In trust, in respect, in the knowledge that he had done the right thing when doing the wrong thing would have been so much easier." Tommy looked at the coffin, then back at the crowd. "Dad always said the same thing when people asked how he knew to plant sorghum. My grandfather told me. Well, now I'm telling you. Listen to the old ones. Learn from their mistakes. And when everyone else is planting wheat, have the courage to plant sorghum." He smiled, his father's smile, quiet and knowing. "Because the drought always comes. And when it does, You'd better be ready. The Jessup farm is still operating today. Tommy's son Michael runs it now, the fourth generation of Jessups on that Oklahoma land. They grow sorghum, drought-resistant wheat, and raise cattle. They've never taken on debt they couldn't pay in a single season. They've never planted a crop without checking the journal first. And every spring, before the planting begins, Michael Jessup sits down with his own children and reads them the words that Elmer wrote in The drought will come again. It always does. Plant sorghum before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. 4 generations of Jessups. 4 generations of listening. 4 generations of surviving while others failed. That's the power of wisdom passed down. That's the legacy of the wrong crop. That's what happens when you trust your grandfather.